Hey guys, those of you that know me know I love making bread. And so I want to show you guys how to do a plain white loaf of bread. Come on in. Welcome to Kay's Little Kitchen. So real quick, before we get into bread making, let's talk yeast for a second. I think yeast is a very intimidating aspect of bread making for most people. It's why they don't get into it. They've either been too scared to try it or they have tried it, somehow killed their yeast, bread didn't rise, and they gave up. And it is. Yeast can be a tricky thing. It likes right at 110% to activate to do anything with rising dough. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to practice. Just like driving a car, just like learning to play an instrument for the first time, you're going to stumble and bumble around a little bit, right? A couple things to keep in mind when you're activating yeast. Yes, it wants 110 degrees. A lot of things are going to interfere with that temperature. For instance, if you're like me in a hot climate, I live in Texas, we store our yeast in the fridge, which means this is not room temperature yeast. This is very cold yeast, probably about 50 degrees, okay? Not only that, we have cold yeast, but on top of that, we have an air-conditioned room temperature vessel that we're wanting to put all this together and to activate. So with all that in mind and understanding that heat wants to share its heat, so this hot water will not be hot anymore once it touches a cool vessel, and then I put in 50-degree yeast. So I'm going to take my water, the hot water, to activate it, and I'm going to actually bump it up to about 120 degrees. Now, sure, what you can do to learn what these temperatures are is go stick a thermometer underneath your sink water and find out what that is and do muscle memory. Memorize what that is. If you ain't got time for that, that's fine. Buy your yeast in bulk. You're going to turn on your water, okay? You're going to fill a measuring cup or whatever with nice hot hand washing water that will then warm this vessel up, that will then stay warm enough to heat this up and deal with cold yeast, okay? So now that we have all of our hot water, we're going to pour in a quarter cup of our water. And then a package of yeast is 2¼ teaspoons. So what I do is I have a slightly mounded teaspoon. I just sprinkle that along the top. 2¼ I stir this in, and then I'm going to watch it. And what it's going to do is it's going to foam and bubble in 5 minutes. You'll see that there are hardly any bubbles in here, and the yeast is just kind of sitting there at the top of the water. And that is inactive yeast. This is sluggish. This water was too cold. So we'll have to try that again. You can see that this yeast has been activated. It's active, it is bubbling, it is happy. This yeast is ready to be the leaven for any loaf of bread we're making. All right, now that you guys are comfortable with working with yeast, activating yeast, we're going to make bread. I'm going to be showing you guys how I make a basic yeasted bread from a recipe out of my grandmother's cookbook. My grandmother is no longer with us, and so this is kind of a treasured cookbook. She got it sometime between the 40s and the 60s. The copyright page is gone, but if you go look up Better Homes cookbooks on eBay or on their history page, you'll see that this the look of it is from that era, okay? So this is going to be maybe a little different than what you've maybe tried before, okay? We're going to be scalding milk in this recipe. Okay. So to begin with, we're going to be using 2 cups of milk. We're going to go ahead and put it in our pan here. Up to 1 and 2. Alrighty, then we need 2 tablespoons of sugar. Okay, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 tablespoon of shortening. Yes, shortening. Trust me. Okay? It's a little bit more than a tablespoon. We're going to be all right. Now you're going to put this on a medium heat. You're going to whisk it, and it is scalded once you can either see a light film across the top of it, or you'll start to see the milk steam. Okay? But now that our milk is scalded and really hot, we can't introduce yeast to that because yeast likes 110 degrees, and this hot milk mixture will kill our yeast. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it into our stand mixer. We're going to actually run the paddle a little bit to stir it to get the heat to dissipate from it, and then we're going to soften our yeast. You may be asking yourself, why scald milk in any baking recipe? Well, once upon a time, we didn't have pasteurized milk that we purchased at a grocery store. We got raw milk delivered to us by the milkman. And my dad remembers getting fresh milk in the mornings from the milkman and pasteurizing or scalding the milk to 180 degrees would pasteurize it, would make it safe for various things. Another reason why we scald milk in some recipes is the whey that exists in milk will keep the yeast from doing its job. It will slow it down, make it sluggish, not allow the yeast to do the puffing that it needs to do in our breads. So there are several reasons why we scald milk. We no longer have to pasteurize our own milk, but we do need to tell the whey to chill out so that bread can puff. Okay, so we're going to activate our yeast. Remember, we have our warm water, and we're going to put a 1/4 cup of warm water into this vessel. Okay, and what I did today is I did get my yeast out ahead of time to warm it up a little bit, so I don't have to use quite as hot a water as I would have in the past. 2 slightly mounded teaspoons. Stir that in. And then we're going to let it sit for 5 minutes. Okay, we have our milk mixture cooled down to about 115 degrees. So now we are going to add 2 cups of flour. All right, you'll notice that I use 2 different types of flour in my recipes. And that's because most of the time I like to add my home milled whole grain flour to most of what I bake, just to give me extra nutrients and all the goodies that come from home milled flour. So we've added 2 cups of home milled flour to our milk mixture, and we're going to mix that together. And in this recipe, we're not adding all of the flour at once. We've added these 2 cups to make kind of a mush. We want to make sure that our yeast gets fully incorporated before adding any more flour. Okay, now that that has beaten well, we're going to add our softened yeast. We're going to scrape it out. Sometimes it likes to get stuck. Okay, we're going to mix that in. And I'm mixing this in on low, as you can see, to get all of the flour worked in so I'm not throwing flour all over my counter. Once this comes together in kind of a shaggy mass, I'm going to swap over to the dough hook and continue adding the remaining flour. This recipe has a range of flour that you add to it. I would always start on the conservative side, the lowest amount of flour, and watch your dough to see how much flour you actually need. You'll see the mass is kind of coming together and it's going to scrape that flour off the sides of the walls. I want to keep an eye on this when I get to about 4 cups of flour added, because I do not want a dry, rough dough. I want a soft, smooth dough. I'm keeping an eye on my dough, and I'm noticing that it is still sticking to the sides of the bowl here. And as I touch it, it sticks to my fingers. So we need a little bit more flour for this dough. Something to keep in mind when you're baking bread. Whole wheat flour or home milled flour will soak up more of your moisture than the store-bought flours. So you'll want to be more careful about adding too much to make a dried out bread. What you're seeing here, the two ears, I call them, when I'm kneading my bread in my stand mixer, that is what I'm looking for when the dough is ready. When the flour and the water and all the ingredients have come together perfectly, and then I knead it with the machine for 5 minutes. Okay, when it comes to kneading, I've seen a lot of different versions of kneading where people will kind of pull at it and tear at it, but you don't want your dough to be tearing right now. You're building gluten, you're not tearing it down. So what I do is I will roll the dough up on the side and then drive my heel, the heel of my hand, down into it. See how I'm pulling up the sides, putting my heel down through there. And you'll know that your gluten is getting stronger when your dough starts getting stronger and a little bit harder to work with. Okay. And you'll also notice I did not flour my work surface. I don't want to add any more flour to my dough. And so I did not add flour to it. It's a nice, clean, dry work surface. Okay, that is really looking good. I am going to roll it into a ball, a nice solid ball. And I'm going to put this back in its mixing bowl, and it is going to rise for a full hour. But we're going to keep an eye on it. At 45 minutes, we're checking this. Because we live in Texas, because it is humid and hot here, the rise times on most recipes need to be cut back. A little bit of oil goes in the bottom of your bowl. You'll rub the top, quote unquote, top of the bread dough in the oil, flip it over so that it's coated nicely, and cover with a towel. All right, your bread is risen when you can poke at it and see how it leaves little indents. It's almost doubled, but like I said before, because we live in Texas, I don't let this rise go often the entire time a recipe tells me to, because of the humidity and the heat that just pushes everything along. I'm sorry, I use a pump oil to grease my pans because the aerosol spray will leave your pans with a horrible, nasty, tacky feel to them. It's really hard to get clean. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called a petal fold. And that just simply folds all the pieces into the dough. Okay, that's my first forming when I form a loaf, is do the petal fold. Then I gently push it back out, and then I do an envelope. Did all the sides, and then I roll it jelly roll style to a nice tight roll. You can roll it back and forth a couple times. And place seam side down in your pan. And then both of these will get covered again for another 45 minutes. And again, I'm going to keep an eye on this. When the dough starts to get to the sides, when it's tall enough to reach the sides, that's when I preheat the oven so that these go into a nice hot oven for some good oven spring. All right, as you can see, the bread has risen up to be above the side of the pan. I like to put a little split in the top of the loaf just to give it some space to expand. There you have it. Homemade, fresh bread. There's nothing like it. Hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching.